Okay, so this is Institute of Advanced Studies, Loughborough Conversation with Professor Danny Dorling from Oxford University. My name's Professor Darren Smith, and we're going to be talking about issues of immigration, Brexit, and changing society. So Danny, if I can begin by asking you your explanation for Brexit. You suggested, I think, in the public lecture that Brexit was the result of anxieties and disappointment, and with general quality of life and living standards. It wasn't about immigration. What's your view on this?
I mean, immigration mattered, and immigration was used by people who wanted people to vote for Brexit. They splashed immigration on the front pages of their newspapers, and in the opinion polls, people said immigration mattered a great deal. But when you looked at the geography of the vote, it wasn't areas that had many immigrants that voted to leave. In fact, the fewer immigrants you had, the more likely you were to vote to leave. It was areas, and it wasn't the poorest areas, it was the poorest conservative areas that voted to leave the most. It was Middle England, places that had done badly, particularly badly if you don't know about the bottom third. You think you just think it's terrible. And it fitted with rising austerity, rising inequality, rising house prices. The children can't get a home, they can't start a family. A general sense that life in Britain was getting worse, and something must be making it worse. And what could this something be? It must be our membership of the European Union.
So what do you think about those commentators who say it was a kind of reflection of people voting in selfish ways?
I don't think it was selfish. The largest vote to leave was the old, and when you talk to elderly people about their vote and those who vote to leave, they talk about their grandchildren in the future. And if you're old, and the older people were, the more likely they were to leave. Put it very bluntly, if you're this old, you're not actually going to be around that much longer. So people generally were worrying about their grandchildren and how their grandchildren would be able to do things like buy a house, like start a family. And their one option to change things was this vote. Normal elections don't actually give you much power. The MP will get elected regardless of how you vote in most constituencies. We only gave people one chance, and this was their chance, and they took it.
So you've got a legacy of making maps of different social processes and outcomes. The Brexit map, how did that differ to previous maps that you've produced?
I've produced a lot of maps of Britain. The shock about producing the Brexit map is it didn't look like any previous map. So there isn't a simple correlation between voting leave and something else. Certainly not poverty or so on. That doesn't look like a poverty map at all. And even if you took out things like Northern Ireland and Scotland, which behave differently for obvious reasons, you're still left with no pattern that fits another pattern. And it's taken some time to work out. It was Middle England, it was areas that, compared to the poorest parts, aren't doing too badly, but compared to their own way of looking at the world, and if you never go and see some of the poorest parts of Britain, things have slowly got more and more run down in these places. And
Philip Hammond's comments about inequality being at its lowest levels for 30 years, do you have any kind of thoughts on that comment?
So my argument is that Britain became the most economically unequal country in Europe in the last 30 years. The 1% take more in the UK than anywhere else in Europe. The gap between the top 10 and the bottom 10 is bigger than anywhere else. The Gini coefficient, if you want to get technical, that's the highest in the UK. Occasionally Estonia beats us, occasionally Latvia, but we normally beat them. We've won the global race with the most economically unequal country on the continent. Philip Hammond, in his budget, this is the November 2017 budget, began his budget by saying inequality is at its lowest point for 30 years. He was using a measure that ignores the incomes of the best off tenth and the worst off tenth. And I did ask the audience, actually, to tell me why on earth he did this. Because either he's assuming that people listening are stupid and won't realise that this is a stupid statistic, or he is stupid and doesn't realise. Nobody in the audience, this public lecture, could help me, and I am generally confused. If anybody watching this wants to email me and tell me, why did Philip Hammond say something so obviously untrue in a budget speech, and it not picked up, I remain bemused that he can get away with it.
Another comment you made was that immigration in the UK is not too high.
Yes.
What's your views on
that? Well, you can look at the rate of immigration across Europe, and we don't have a particularly high rate. The parts of the UK that have a high rate are basically in London and a few other parts of the southeast. But even that's lower than the rate into Switzerland and the rate into Spain and so on, which is partly us moving to Spain. Northern England, the west of England and parts of Wales have some of the lowest rates of immigration in Europe. They're akin to Eastern Europe in terms of the numbers of people turning up. To claim that, it's a sudden arrival of large numbers of immigrants, the places where large numbers of immigrants turned up in the main were the most enthusiastic to remain in the European Union, even though the immigrants didn't get a vote. So, it's quite incredible. There were a few areas, tiny number of areas, which had recently had a rapid rise on the East Coast, but they were the minority. In general, it's the other way around. If immigrants were not turning up in your area, you were angry about immigrants.
And you also said that actually having no immigration is a bad thing. It's bad news for society. What's your views on that topic?
In general, you can use immigration rates as a measure of how well a place is doing economically. So 100 years ago, the highest rate of immigration in the world was to California. It was a gold rush. California was doing very well. People were going to California. When it's outside of your country, you tend to associate immigration with things that are going well. The second highest rate was the South Welsh valleys, and there was a rush to get in to coal. And we don't look at the valleys now and say, oh, it's terrible, there's immigrants. We actually think of them as Welsh, because they are Welsh. But, they didn't come from Wales originally. Immigrants turn up in places where there's a reason to turn up for. And when they turn up, they generate more jobs and things going. When they stop coming, something's gone badly wrong to an area. And so seeing immigration as a problem is, in a way, misguided. People have been taught to see it as a problem. But you don't want to live somewhere where nobody is ever turning up. I've been to some places where nobody's ever turning up, and eventually the population falls. You have to begin to demolish the houses. Everybody gets old. It's not good.
And you described the East Midlands and Loughborough as Brexit central. What was you thinking for that label?
I was just looking at the map, and I was pointing out where we were on this map, and I suddenly realised the amount Brexit's colour blue on this map, and the amount of blue around this was larger than anywhere else on the map. So we are in. East Midlands, we've known that the region actually had the highest proportion when you work out by region, but around the region it is the centre of. So this part of the country, to fit with what I was saying earlier about Conservative voters, this isn't like Newcastle or Liverpool. This isn't a really strong Labour voting area. This is a part of the country where the Conservatives can win seats, but only just. Right? It's the bottom end of the Tory party kind of territory. It's the opposite to Hampstead and Highgate for Labour. Hampstead and Highgate is the poshest area Labour might ever win, and then the next area is quite a long way down. The East Midlands has got a lot of areas which are essentially the kind of lowest on the social scale that the Tories can help to win. So not that low. You have to be doing pretty well as an area to have a Tory majority in a seat. But from the point of view of a Conservative, it doesn't get any lower than this, because that land beneath Sheffield, you don't know there because they haven't had an MP who's Tory for years. So the East Midlands, it's Middle England, it's the battleground. And it's the place where people were most upset about our membership of the European Union, but also the direction in which the country was taking. And they thought that this could be solved by Britain going it alone. Whereas in other parts of the country, particularly the poorest parts, people think the thing can be solved by voting Labour and getting a national government that actually cares.
And I guess you were being slightly provocative, but you mentioned that we don't know our history. Britain doesn't know its history. What did you mean?
Well, it's not our fault we don't know our history, but when if you're looking at what's said about the vote, then there are lots of quotes from people who work very hard for Brexit about how we need to regain our rightful place at the top of the world. And this is partly because of our history and having an empire, but they view all of that as wonderful. No sense that there was anything ever bad or not to be proud of about when Britain was the richest country in the world. And the other problem we have, unlike most other countries, is because for a long time, very long time, we haven't lost a war, we haven't had a revolution, we haven't been invaded. We've never had a moment when we've had to look at who we are in the way that Germans have had to look at who they are and produce a much more honest story of what happened in the past. We have slowly built up, at least since the Act of Union, a myth about our long British history going over centuries and centuries and millennia from the Roman times onwards. And we have songs about it, we have Land of Hope and Glory, we waved flags last night at the proms. We've never had a kind of realising that we're not all wonderful, which other countries have almost all had. And so we have a kind of naive patriotism.
What about migration flows and the kind of the tension between the immigration of young skilled people and the immigration of the ageing?
Well, the irony, there are so many ironies geographically about the Brexit vote. I mean, we're the first country to leave after Greenland, which was a tiny, tiny area with 56,000 people that left. Now, you might argue that one of the reasons we left is that we had a bad deal. Now, we actually had a special deal financially negotiated by Margaret Thatcher where we didn't pay our fair share in. So we actually paid less than we should do by the formula. So we had the best financial deal. But on top of that, we were, because of the English language and other attractions, we were bringing in very large numbers of very highly skilled young people who've been born in another country, educated at the expense of another country. And then we only took them in their 20s, they turn up, they clean our hotels, they deliver our babies, particularly in the big cities. They're the midwives, they keep our universities running. We didn't pay for them. And as we're doing this, we're also sending our better off older people out to spend the last of their days in Spain and France and Cyprus and Malta. And we're the biggest emigrant community. And somebody else's health service and somebody else's bin men are looking after them. And they're not going and being economically productive, they're spending their days in the sun. We had by far the best demographic deal in the whole of the European Union and the best financial deal. And we voted by a majority of 52 to 48 to throw it away. I mean, no wonder the other EU27 are a bit bemused.
Now, Nigel Farage is often seen as a kind of pivotal key figure in the Brexit. What's the influence of James Goldsmith?
James Goldsmith was more important at the beginning of this. If you're looking at popular support for parties that supported Brexit and essentially far-right parties initially in Britain, the biggest rise initially was in 1997 with the referendum party that Goldsmith financed and set up. And he basically paid for it. He paid for the candidates to stand, he paid their deposits, he paid to have a video sent to every house in the country. It cost him a fortune and he got between 1 or 2% of the vote, which is tiny, but bigger than nothing. It then drops back again down, but then when UKIP began to take over later, it drops up for the 2004 election, then popular support drops down, then it's pushed up again for 2009, it goes down, then it goes up again for 2014, another European election, up for the referendum, incredible levels of support, and it's plummeted right down now to 1%. 1% of the public support parties like UKIP now. So there's no strong and steady popular rising sentiment against the European Union. There's been some very careful political campaigning to get people at the right moment to change their views when it was needed.
You mentioned that Brexit wasn't as important as a war,
yes,
but probably more important than the Suez crisis.
Yes.
What did you mean?
There are occasionally events that have fundamental effects on British society and structure, and the biggest two are the First and the Second World War. Inequality peaked when the Titanic sank in 1913, and then because of the cost of the war, because of the effect, because you had to raise taxes on the rich to pay for it, the First World War was the moment at which the gap between the rich with their mansions and their servants and everybody else began to narrow. The Second World War accelerated that and again changed our attitudes to each other. People who'd fought together weren't going to go back and then at home allowed themselves to be treated in the way they had in the 1930s. The Suez crisis was much, much smaller, but again a military thing, but it was, we suddenly realised that we were no longer one of the most powerful countries in the world. The Americans could tell us to get lost, and they did. And it changed our identity from thinking that the empire was still really there to realising it had gone, but not completely. I mean, one thing the Brexit voters taught us is that this sense of superiority that we should have a higher place in the world has lingered on and is still there. And so we're looking at something that economically and in the psyche and culturally is likely to be much bigger than Suez, and economically damaging and socially changing. But occasionally those things can produce a better society, and it's far better that this better society might come about because of this than if we'd had a war. There are blessings you have to kind of grab at from all this.
So crystal ball question, thinking about the possible impacts of Brexit and so on. You cited some maps by Freddie Heineken.
Oh yes.
What was you thinking there in terms of using
Why did I do those? These were maps. Freddie Heineken, who's the grandson of the Heineken who started the beer company and who went on to actually get back a 51% share in that company, very successful conservative liberal businessman, paid a couple of historians in 1992 to produce a new map of Europe suggesting how the big countries could be split up into small regions to overcome the problem of the dominance of large countries in Europe. And the maps were remarkably prescient. I mean, these large countries have not split up, but the regions of Yugoslavia, they predicted, actually have become countries. And for the UK, the prediction was a united Ireland, a separate Scotland, and, you know, we're not there, but we're moving towards there faster than at any point for a century. And nowhere else in Europe is moving quite so fast towards Heineken's kind of European utopian map. It also divides up England, and that may sound fanciful until you remember that London voted Remain, and London is very, very likely to be very damaged. Well, you cannot run London without people from the mainland. You only have to go and spend a day in London to realise that London will not work without people from the mainland. You cannot run the banks of London without passported access to the mainland. London doesn't work with Brexit. We've put ourselves in quite a remarkable situation, and it really shows we, the elite, the supposed really clever people, everybody else, we just didn't really know where we were, what was possible, what the effect of this would be.
So my final question. You're locked in a room today with Theresa May and David Davis. What would you tell them about Brexit?
I think Theresa May already knows it's a disaster. Everybody around her in her inner circle, from her husband and his financial firm onwards, is telling her it's a disaster. I think she knows. I think she believes she has some innate sense of duty to kind of carry on and do the best and publicly say it's not a disaster, but you can see it in her eyes. She knows it's a disaster. I think David Davis has learned it's a disaster. I don't think he did know a few months ago, but I don't think he is, that bullheaded. I think David Davis has just begun to realise. And again, I think, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I watch him, and I can see a man who now knows he's presiding over a crash. Their problem is that their party is deeply, deeply split. The membership and the grassroots of the party are even more split over this. This is a crucial defining issue for them. They've told promises to a country, about what they're going to do. Even if at the very last hour, or the very last day in March 2018, Theresa May sends a telegram to Brussels rescinding that letter, and she can do that legally, and suddenly we're not leaving. In many ways, we've kind of left. We've certainly done a huge amount of the damage, but we've also done a lot of learning about ourselves. It won't all be bad, but we're going to agonise about hard Brexit, soft Brexit, another referendum, whatever, for the next year or more. I think most of the effect of the vote will be the same regardless of that actual choice. We're not going to suddenly become a country in which people from the mainland of Europe are going to go, oh, they look like they're going to welcome me. I'll go over there and try and start a new life for myself in that place. We have kind of publicly shamed ourselves. But we've also publicly, actually expressed that we don't think that this way of living and working is worth carrying on. We're willing to take a huge risk for something else. The desire for something fundamentally different than the direction we've been going in for the last 40 years is enormous. And we're happy to risk a lot of things just for a chance of changing that. So if you're a social scientist, this is absolutely fascinating. The only problem is that I happen to live in this country as well.
Thanks, Danny Dorling. Thanks for coming to the Institute of Advanced Studies at Loughborough University. Thank you.
Cheers.